last week we looked at the battle of Ai, where Achan's sin led to the defeat at Ai. And what was really disappointing was they had this thrilling victory at Jericho, where the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, and they were able to take the city. They're on all-time, high. They're fulfilling and walking in the purposes of God. They're doing exactly um, as God had commanded them, and things are going well, right? Things are going well. So they go from Jericho, but unfortunately, they go to defeat, from Jericho to defeat. And Achan commits what we call harem. We remember we spoke about this, which could be indicative of a ban or anything that's given over to the Lord. It's a devoted, sacred thing that's given over to God. So we talked about, the harem meaning, what it means it could mean something's destroyed. God told Joshua to go in and destroy everything in Jericho, save for the spoils, bring them back into the treasury. Harem can mean something dedicated. It could mean, like, the tithes. It could mean the garments, for example, that Achan stole was brought into the treasury. So that was harem. To steal that is harem. It was to touch the devoted thing. It was to steal or take the devoted thing, right? It could be, we talked about complete destruction in war. It could be property. It could be a matter of consecration, something that's being consecrated to God. And from a church perspective or ecclesiastic perspective, in some faiths in Jewish community, harem is the most severe sensory, or it's like how we exclude people is based on them committing harem, something that's unforgivable, for lack of a better term, or the ultimate punishment, rather. Okay, so we asked the question: can one man spoil it for everybody? Right, and I think there was an overwhelming agreement that one man can indeed spoil it for everyone. And we talked about his sin. He's confronted by Joshua. Sorry, back up. God then says, Joshua, you know, why are you lying on your face? Because after this victory, Joshua's trying to figure out what's going on. He doesn't understand why. He doesn't understand what. And then God says to him, they have taken the accursed thing, the harem, and they have stolen and deceived, and they put it amongst their own things. So the children of Israel could not stand before their enemies, but turned their back before their enemies, because they have become doomed to destruction. Neither will I be with you anymore unless you destroy the accursed thing from among you. Now, let's take us back to Joshua chapter 1, where there's this promise that God makes to Joshua that I'll never leave you, I'll be with you, be strong, be courageous. As I was with Moses, so will I be with you. All you need to do is follow the commandments, don't depart from them, and I will give you everywhere the sole of your feet trods upon, I'll give it to you. Well, here, after this, he's saying, I'm not going to be with you anymore unless you destroy the accursed thing from you. So you need to get up, sanctify the people, sanctify yourselves. There is an accursed thing in your midst, and you cannot stand before your enemies until you take away this accursed thing. So what did he do? He took the accursed thing. It was not just the Babylonian garment in itself. It was that it was devoted to the treasury, and he stole this. He took 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold weighing about 50 shekels. This is the equivalent of, maybe in our day and age, maybe $3,000 to $4,000 worth of things, in addition to the Babylonian garment that he took from the treasury. So that's not a little bit of money. He took a lot of money. He took the church money, basically, right? So this is an act of harem. So the nation as a whole was in this covenant relationship with God, and because one member transgressed it, the entire nation's relationship with God was damaged. We talked about an example of this with Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve, because of the sins of Adam, we today are now paying for that, because sin has come into the world by way of one man's disobedience. And really, we can see the power of purity and how important that is in the church. One man can thwart it, uh, and the us together, united, can propel the work of God. And also, God is holy and just, and disobedience comes with the risk of dire consequences. Sometimes, because a thunderbolt doesn't come from the heaven and strike someone down, or there's not an immediate death or an immediate harm done to somebody, we underestimate that God is watching. He's always mindful. We should be mindful that He's watching and that He's ever present, uh, and beholds the good and the bad. So, what was the consequence? What would the consequence be? Joshua 7:15 says that he who's taken the cursed thing shall be burned with fire. He and all that he has, because he's transgressed the covenant with God and has done this disgraceful thing. I asked the question: should everything burn? Do you think it's right for everything to have burnt? And we got into the inquiry where Joshua confronts Achan over this, and he does admit it. He does admit that, yes, I did this thing, and then the consequence was carried out. Remember, Joshua. One of the themes in Joshua is completely obedient to whatever God says, right? Whatever the commandment that Moses laid down, Joshua always represents an obedience to this law. And so if God says everything should burn, Joshua was going to fulfill that. Joshua represents complete obedience to um, to the commandments. Now, the question we asked, we had a good discussion last week on why would a loving God allow for this to happen? That being for Achan's family, his children, his pets, his goats or cows at the time, his tent, his home, everything that he owned uh, was burnt, destroyed. They were stoned and then it was burnt and destroyed. And I encouraged you to wrestle with how would you respond to this question, right? And um, is how could a good and loving God do that? And we talked about the paradox between um, good and what is good, right? Because sometimes good, when we think of good, we think of what's favorable for us. Uh, we don't think of judgment, because judgment can be good, right? Judgment can be good. If I were to, let's say beat somebody up and the police came and took me to Starbucks, then the family of this person that I beat up would probably not think that would be good, or that would be good judgment. If I were thrown into jail, they would deem that to be good. So the right judgment can be good, but perhaps not for those involved. So the other thing to consider is we would not be able to survive if we receive the just punishments for all our faults. I've made a lot of mistakes in life, and if it wasn't for the atoning blood of Christ, then I wouldn't survive the rightful punishments I deserve for all the mistakes that I've made in life. So we talked about this. We talked about a quote from E.S. Lewis about God and what goodness means. We had some great discussion on what is good. Sometimes we have to remember that we see only a small bit of the fabric. Think of a giant quilt with different patches on it, and we sometimes see only one patch, and we question God based on that one patch. We question, why is this happening? Why is that happening? But we have to be mindful that God, He sees the entire quilt. He sees how the colors, the patches weave in together, and so He is able to behold everything, and so we ought to trust that He knows what's good. He knows what's best. We are only able to see with our finite minds, a limited piece of the puzzle. Then we talked about the problem of evil. I won't get into that. And then we talked about free will being one of the perhaps strongest combats to the problem of evil, being why would a perfectly loving God allow evil? And the best response to that would be because he gives humans the choice to accept or reject his will, and free will being a fundamental part of any relationships, right? I mean, why would anybody want a relationship with somebody who did not have free will? That wouldn't be a relationship. It would be like owning a robot. Okay. So I wanted to take us through chapter 7. Anybody have any questions on chapter 7 before we move on? No? All right. So let's move on. Okay, so Joshua chapter 7, right? We talked about we just talked about Israel was defeated by AI uh, due to Achan's sin. He commits this haram, and we see here the consequence of disobedience, right? In Achan's story, we see how important it is to be obedient to God, and how when we walk away from God's desires in our life, or when we choose to go away from God, that could lead to adverse impacts, adverse effects in our life. They lost the victory because one man was disobedient. An entire nation lost the battle, and that just goes to show the importance that one person's obedience or disobedience can make. So they chapter number 8, after chapter number 7, sorry, closes. In chapter number 8, the Bible says that God's anger turns from them after Achan's was stoned and destroyed. um it was turned from Israel, so he had forgiven them, he had moved on. And so a question today I have for you guys is, have you ever had to correct a mistake? Have you ever had to correct a mistake? I'd love to hear about a mistake you've had to correct.
Can I have some? Can I have some?
Okay, so let's move on. So there's many times where in life we have mistakes. We do things, and we have to go back and correct them. We have to do it the right way. So they recognize that God had called them to reach the promised land, to conquer territory. Joshua recognizes this, and God says to Joshua, because you have this accursed thing, I can't be with you anymore. So you got to get rid of it. So they get rid of it. They fix the problem, and then they pursue, they go back and pursue to make things right, to pursue AI. So now the Lord says to Joshua, do not be afraid, nor be dismayed. Remember this, Joshua chapter 1. Remember this promise that God makes to Joshua in Joshua chapter 1. He makes this promise to him, and we're seeing it again, right? Be courageous, be strong. Now he's telling Joshua this throughout. We're going to see throughout the book of Joshua, we'll see that God is telling him this, and he says, do not be afraid, do not be dismayed. Take these people with you, arise and go. See, I've given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land, and you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho. Only its spoil and its cattle you shall take as a booty for yourself. And I found some irony here, because uh, in Jericho, they were to take the spoils and put them into the treasury. Achan doesn't do this. Achan suffers with his life. The very next battle, they take the spoils, the booty, they take it for themselves. They get to keep this. So it's funny that, I mean, if Achan had only been not been so covetous, if Achan had not been so consumed with greed, the very next battle, he would have had something to take for himself. And so I highlighted this because I found that very interesting. The irony in that is that it's pinned right beside a story of Achan who steals The very next chapter, God is saying, you're going to keep the spoils for yourself. And almost answering Achan's disobedience. Um, so next we see God has a plan in by which they are going to conquer Ai, right? And I've included a picture to the left that kind of shows the setup of this plan. So there would be the main force. If you could see my cursor here, there would be the main force that would approach Ai, the city being on top of the hill, would approach them and lure them out of the city. So when they would approach, the men of war would approach, uh, the children of Israel would make it seem as though they were fleeing, so running in the opposite direction, making it seem as though they were afraid. Joshua 8:15 says, Joshua and all the Israel made as if they were beaten before them and fled by the way of the wilderness. So all the people who were in Ai were called together to pursue them, pursuing the children of Israel. And they pursued Joshua, and they were drawn away from the city. There was not a man left in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. So everybody went after them. And this is a part of the plan. God's plan was to draw the people of Ai out of the city, draw them all out of the city. What would happen after that is you see there's, I don't know how big or small it is, on your screen, but there's these men here carrying fire to the west of the city, and they would ambush the city with fire. So once the men were drawn out, the ambush would come with the fire, they would burn down the city. So once they would burn down the city, the men would then almost entrap the men of Ai. So the men of Ai would flee, had to flee away because they were caught between these men here, these men here who were met down here. So it's almost a trap. They were forced out of the city to be met with these met forces, and then these forces also would trap them behind. So there was nowhere for them to run at all. So then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out your spear that's in your hand, and I will give it into your hand." Joshua stretches out the spear in his hand toward the city. So those in ambush arose quickly out of their place. They ran as soon as he had stretched out his hand, and they entered the city and took it, and hurried to set the city on fire. And when the men of Ai looked behind them, like I was talking about, they looked behind them, they saw and behold the smoke that ascended to the heavens, and they had no power to flee this way or that way. And the people who fled to the wilderness turned their back on the pursuers. So then they're destroyed. God's plan in action, and they're following God's plan. Then they were destroyed. It came to pass that Israel made an end of slaying all the inhabitants of Ai in the wilderness. They pursued them, and all of them had fallen by the edge of the sword. Um, and so it was all that fell that day. Both men and women were 12,000 in Ai that fell that day. So Joshua and his army defeated 12,000 people. For Joshua did not draw back his hand, with which he stretched out the spear, until they utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Now, this stretching of the spear that he's doing, does this remind you of anybody?
Moses?
Yeah, right?
Hmm.
Right? Reminds you of Moses a bit, right? So
Mhm.
we're seeing how, God's fulfilling. As I was with Moses, so will I be with you, right? And we're seeing these little things that are showing us, that God is keeping his promise and fulfilling them. So only the livestock and the spoil of the city did they take, according to the word of the Lord. So Joshua burned Ai, made it a heap forever, a desolation to this day. And the king of Ai, he hung on the tree until the evening. As soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded them to take them down, take the king down. So now Joshua almost rights what was wrong, and he renews the covenant with the children of Israel. He sits them down, and I won't read this whole passage down, but I'll paraphrase. He sits them down. He builds an altar to God, he sits the people down and he reads the words of the law, Moses' law. He reads it to them, the blessings in the law, the cursings. He read everything in the book, and there was not a word that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before the assembly of Israel. So, again, Joshua is really reinforcing, a part of Joshua is really reinforcing the law of Moses, really upholding the commandment of God. And after Achan's sin cost them to lose the battle, Joshua felt it important to renew the covenant. And that's what we ought to do when we fall or we come into any sort of sin or disobedience. We ought to renew our covenant with God. He's faithful and just, promising to forgive our sins and iniquities and cast them into the sea of forgetfulness. So Joshua recognizes this victory after the accursed thing was purged. He gets the victory, and then he renews his covenant with God. Any questions on this so far? No? So what are the key themes? One, obedience, right? Their victory is really a direct result of their ability to follow God's commands, right? This story is actually the opposite. Chapter 7, we see disobedience in Achan. Chapter 8, we see the rewards of faith and obedience. So it's almost contrasting one with the other. We see fulfillment. God's fulfilling the promise he made to Joshua in chapter 1. I'll be with you everywhere you go, right? As long as you obey my commands. Achan didn't obey the command. That's why they fell. But they got rid of the accursed thing, the sin, the harem. They got rid of that. They moved forward in obedience and faith, and they got the victory. So God fulfilling his promise to him that if you follow my commands, I'm going to give you everywhere the sole of your feet trod upon. And the next theme, trust, right? Joshua trusts God's plans. He trusts what God says, and eventually it leads to victory. And finally, renewal, right? There was a renewing at the end where they had built an altar, rededicating themselves to God and to his service. Okay, so I think we could do chapter 9. Chapter 9 is very interesting, but before we do that, any questions on chapter 8, comments, anything that stood out to you at all?
I mean, like the contrast that from showing them that if you be obedient, look what will happen for you if you just chill out. Like it's a good way to see how when you're disobedient you get nothing, and when you're obedient you can have abundance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agree. And the irony is, they got to keep the spoils this time, right? Last time they had to put it into the treasury and they stole it. But the very next time, God says, okay, you know what? Yeah, you can keep it.
Yeah, you imagine how much it was that they got to keep.
Yeah, exactly. So, yes, I totally agree with that. It's a good contrast. And I think the writer puts them side by side for a reason, right? We see the story of Achan, disobedience, and then the battle of Ai to recapture what really was their battle to win in the first place. So let's move on. Joshua chapter 9. I think we can get through this in the next 10 minutes. Joshua chapter 9. So, has anybody ever been tricked before? Have you ever been deceived or tricked?
Yeah.
Maybe it hurt
Yes,
you
by my boss.
to find out?
I've been tricked before.
So here in the story of chapter 9, this happens. And let me set the stage here. So in Joshua chapter 9, the surrounding kingdoms, they hear of Joshua's victories. They hear of Israel, how, Jericho's walls fell. They're starting to hear about how there was ambushes set in Ai. They're terrified of of the children of Israel because now they're taking over territory and they're moving at a rapid pace as far as conquering territory. So the other kingdoms, the surrounding kingdoms, they start to conspire against Israel. They start to think of a way to slow them down, to thwart them off of God's purpose. But the Gibeonites, who were close, and I've shared a map at the side. That's not an actual live picture of Joshua, so that's probably just that's like a cartoon picture. But the Gibeonites, however, they choose a different tactic. They choose to be deceptive versus conspiring against the children of Israel. So what do? The Gibeonites, they dress in worn out clothes, with patch sandals and old sacks and cracked wineskins. They present themselves as distant travelers who are weary and impoverished, old and moldy stuff. They put on a disguise, almost going before to visit the children of Israel, Joshua, and present themselves as needy, as someone that should be felt sorry for. They do not want to be a threat because Joshua and his army have defeated and conquered every single threat. So they are going for the opposite. They want to be seen as almost beggars before the children of Israel. So then the Gibeonites tell Joshua, they say, hey, we've heard of all your victories. We've heard of all the things that God has done for you. We are from a very, very far country and we are so tired from our journey. We just want a treaty of peace. We want to make a covenant of peace with you. In other words, we're hopeless. We're harmless. We want peace with you. We just want to be at peace with you. We don't want any trouble. So they are intentionally being deceitful because why? Gibeon was next. If we go to this, even to here, you could see they conquered Jericho. They conquered Ai. Guess who probably was next? Gibeon, right? So they go before them and they say, look, we've heard all the things that God has done for you. We want peace. We don't want any trouble. We don't want any problems. And so Joshua and the leaders of Israel, they make a covenant with Gibeon. They make a covenant and they don't consult God about the request. They don't talk to God or ask God. But they're deceived by the Gibeonites. They're deceived by their appearance. They're deceived by their words. They present themselves as somebody to be sorry for. They present themselves as somebody that is not a threat. And so they make a covenant with Gibeon, promising that they will protect them, promising that they will not attack them, but that they would be at peace with them always. So my question to you is, would you keep the promise? I'd like to hear from everybody. Would you keep the promise?
No.
Why? You have to say why.
No.
Okay. I heard a few know why.
I wouldn't keep the promise because easily they could betray you, just how a few other people in the Bible betrayed another person. Not treaty, but people betray other people.
Boom, boom, boom. Boom, boom.
So maybe
Okay. Anyone else?
I would say yes. I will keep the promise. I would keep it because they came out of a desperate situation, and they they were seeking help. And this is it's like a beggar asking for change. Like whatever you can give me, I'll appreciate it, type of thing.
I agree with Mo, what she said too. I was gonna say that.
I don't know.
Well, to be clear, they were not beggars. They were wealthy. They're probably wealthier than Israel at the time, but they were beggars. They were not beggars. They were intentionally deceitful.
Yes, but they came out of desperation because they fear that they want to be.
I mean, that's a problem. That's the problem. They were deceitful about it because they let their fear get to them. If they just come, they things could all be different.
But later on, the Joshua confronted them.
I think I would keep the promise.
Why would you keep the promise, Mom?
Because when you promise to do something and it's right, you keep that rights, right?
Fair enough.
But later on, Joshua confronts them and says, "Hey, you lied to me. Why? Why did you lie?" But he already made the promise with them. So, like it.
Well, the question is, we're not there yet. When do you keep?
Oh. I will keep the promise. I will keep it just. I will keep it based out of how you presented yourself to me. How I would base it off of that. How you approached me, how you handle the situation, and until I found out the truth, how did you conducted yourself, right? And they after they said, okay, you sure you can remain with us. In that, like, I didn't hear anything of them trying to like kill anyone in the camp. So I will honor the promise based off of that, like how it was presented, how you approach the situation.
Yeah, but can you like really say it's a real promise? Because if the promise was made under the guise of you being deceitful, then doesn't that make the promise null and void?
But then if like think of it in a real life situation, like would someone came to you and is asked, like you would just look at them and just say no, like
I would say no, but I would want to hear a clear explanation as to why you felt you needed to do that, and based on what I'm hearing and your sincerity.
But they said why they did it.
So in the end, yeah. I mean, it's debatable. It's a debatable thing.
Yeah. Now, a few things that I want to point out. One, they're a rival kingdom, so we got to get into Joshua's state of mind, right?
They're the enemy.
They're a rival kingdom, i.e., an enemy. They are not the children of Israel, so they are enemies, rightfully so. They're not likely people that you would not have killed. So they discover the truth. 3 days later, they discover the Gibeonites are actually neighbors living within the same land, and they're angry. They feel betrayed. They're upset about this. Joshua calls them and saying, why have you beguiled us? You beguiled us. We are very far from you. Now, therefore, you are cursed, and there shall none of you be freed from being bondmen. So he makes them woodcutters and warrior water carriers for the community. But despite the anger, the Israelites honor their oath. They made a commitment, and so they decided to honor it, right? This decision upholds the sanctity of oaths. So this is what we see here. The sanctity of an oath exists, even oaths that are made under deception are honored, right?
Now you see, now that's powerful, because now if I go give my word and you lie to me, because I have to be an honorable person. I gotta keep my word, even though you did that. But I like the fact that he made them pretty much servants for the deception. But you can stay with us, but here's the punishment for your lie. You're
Sure.
gonna be woodcutters. I say,
And
okay, that's fair.
isn't that how God works?
Yeah.
God, if God makes you a promise, um, you know, He makes this promise to you. Not to say that you can't ruin it, but I mean, I think that we make some promises to God, not maybe being purely honest. Lord, I'm gonna do this. God, if you do this for me, I'm gonna go to church every Sunday. Lord, if you do this for me, I'm gonna read my Bible. I'm gonna do this, or I'm gonna. We do that. We do this all the time, don't we? Lord, if you just do this for me, I'm gonna do that for you. And sometimes we don't hold up our end of the bargain, right? So this the part I want to highlight here though is they keep their word. They made a commitment and they keep their word. God says, I honor my word above my very name. He honors his word above his very name. So if he says something, it is going to come to pass. And so Joshua is embolizing this, that I said something, so I got to keep my word, even though you didn't, even though you deceived me, even though you didn't, I said I was going to do something. So the question is, when do you not keep your word? Do you see the importance of, you know, do you think that somebody's dishonesty should cause you to break your word?
Okay, well, that's two questions in one. Let's answer the first thing. When should you, I guess, not keep your word? Is when you
Mhm.
haven't given your word. Then there's nothing to keep.
So if you've given your word,
So if you give your word, if you give your word to something, then at this rate, you should honor it, because why make a liar out of yourself? Even though, yes, someone could deceive you. Now we know better. But your word is your word. And that's why you shouldn't give your word that lightly.
That's suppose you didn't give your word.
If you don't give your word, there's nothing to keep.
This is just a little side note thing here. Is there any connection to this promise and the promise of the spies and the harlots? Is there any connection? Any connection there?
what in what way?
As in, like, well, this girl, she made a promise with them, and they believed her that she wouldn't say anything.
Mm-hmm.
So now here's these guys. Yes, they're deceitful, but they made their promise, so they have to like honor it. So was there any connection there? Like they did it for someone, did it for them, so now they have to do it for someone. Was that?
I wouldn't say that there was a connection, but I would say that it's another example of a time where Joshua gave his word and he kept it. So Joshua says, if you hide these spies, I will spare you in your house and your family. And she does that. Rahab does that. And he keeps his promise. When he takes over the land, he spares Rahab, the harlot. And so here, he gives a promise. And I think it's very representative of God in that when God makes a promise to us, he's faithful to keep it, right? And so Joshua makes a promise, even though he's frustrated with their deception, with their lies, which maybe God sometimes is frustrated with us. He still keeps his promise. He still keeps his promise. There's a consequence, but he still keeps his promise. Okay, so what can we learn? One, the importance of seeking God's counsel in all decisions. Whenever we make a choice or a decision in life, it's important that we involve God, that we try our best to seek Him and determine what He is saying to us. Secondly, there's real danger. They say never judge a book by its cover, right? So there's real danger in relying on appearance, the way people look, uh, the way they present themselves. Sometimes that's what we do when we believe people, or we hear a story, or we make a decision, it's based on surface things. It's based on how the way a person looks or human reasoning, right? Um, we should always trust God, and seek His counsel, not just our ability to be rational or our ability to make a decision, but we should seek God and what He's and what He's revealing to ourselves about a particular situation. Um, Also, the seriousness of making and keeping covenants. We talked about keeping covenants, but the seriousness about making covenants. I think the Bible says, I believe it says, it's better for you to not make an oath than to make an oath and break it, right? So uh, when we give our word to somebody, we have to understand that there's a significant weight in that. There's very few things we have in this life, and your word is one of them. When you give your word, it's a bond, it's a covenant, you're establishing a thing between you and another person. And so if you're giving your word, that's serious, right? You should take that very seriously. So there's a seriousness in making and keeping covenants. God does this, makes and keeps covenants. And so we should aim to do the same. And again, the consequences of not seeking God's wills. What does God want in this particular situation? What does God want in this interaction, right? Discernment and counsel from God is extremely important. And that's what we learn. Even though Joshua's successful, even though Joshua's army is conquering territory, even though they're doing all of these great things, they find themselves in a position where they make mistakes. They trust somebody that they shouldn't have trusted. And each one of us on this call have found ourselves in this position. We trusted somebody, and you say to yourself, I knew it. I shouldn't have trusted them. Or I knew it. I got myself into this, right? So it can happen. It can happen, right? Joshua is battle after battle. He's winning victories, and then he comes into not a fight, a physical fight, but he comes into being tricked by a neighboring city. So in closing, this is indeed a very cautionary tale, right? The story of the Gibeonites serves as a reminder to be wise and discerning. It highlights the need for prayer and seeking God's guidance as we go through our day to day. And finally, really, I think probably one of the biggest ones, it emphasizes the importance of integrity and keeping our promises. And that's one of the things that I wanted to challenge each of us today is the integrity of keeping our promises, and things that you say you're going to do, you do. Things that you say you're not going to do, you do not. So with that, I am going to end on time today. I believe that is it.